Before we get into this case, a quick caution. This episode involves the killing of a child and contains details some listeners may find especially heavy. Please listen with care. On January 4th, 2016, a 911 call came in from a man named Robert Short. He was calling from Columbus, Georgia, and the words he had to say were the kind of words no person should ever have to speak. Someone had killed his family, his wife, son, and his granddaughter. When police arrived at the residence, they entered the home and immediately saw two victims lying on the ground. They were already deceased. Then officers moved farther into the home. They checked the master bedroom, then the walk in closet. Inside the closet, they found a young man lying on the ground. He had been taped up. The scene gave investigators several details right away. The front door was locked, not just closed, but deadbolted. The window in the master bedroom was open. Clothing, jewelry, and vehicles were reported missing. At first glance, some of that pointed toward robbery. But what makes this case so devastating is not only the violence inside that home, it is what the violence revealed. Because this was not a simple story about a house being entered, it was a story about care being exploited, about generosity being answered with cruelty, about a family making room for someone in their lives only for that closeness to become part of what destroyed them. And that kind of betrayal lands differently because when violence comes from a stranger, it shocks us. But when it comes through someone who has already been loved, already been welcomed, already been treated like one of our own, it leaves behind a different kind of wound, one that reaches far beyond the crime scene. And by the time the truth began to shape up, this case would no longer be defined by the possibility of a break in, it would be defined by the betrayal of trust. This is Murder in the Black. Today we're talking about the murders of 54-year-old Gloria Short, 17-year-old Caleb Short, and 10-year-old Gianna Lindsay, who is affectionately known as Gigi. 3 generations, one family, one home, and a level of betrayal that still makes this case hard to sit with. Robert Short identified the bodies for police. Gloria was his wife, Caleb was his son, and Gianna was his granddaughter. But before we talk about the investigation, we have to talk about who they were. Because cases like this can become a list of evidence very quickly. You hear about the tape, blood, cars, interviews, suspects, confessions, pleas, and sentences. And all that is significant because that's how investigators build the road from horror to accountability. But before there was a case, there was a family. Gloria Short was described as loving, energetic, and fun loving. She was the kind of woman people called everybody's mama. That description says a lot. It means she was not just important in her own household, she had a presence that reached beyond it. Some people are like that. They make space, make people feel seen. They have a way of becoming a part of the emotional structure of everyone around them. Gloria's daughter, Shamika, had a daughter named Gianna. To the family, Gianna was Gigi, and Gigi was loved deeply. Gloria spoiled her granddaughter. That was a part of the rhythm of their relationship. Grandmothers are supposed to spoil their grandkids. They have a special kind of love, that kind that feels softer around the edges, the kind that makes room for treats, laughter, and a little extra attention. That was the nature of Gigi's relationship with Gloria. Gigi was only 10 years old. She was still in elementary school, still matriculating through childhood, still moving toward all the ordinary milestones a child should get to have. And then there was Caleb. Caleb was 17. He was the baby of the family, not just because he was the youngest, but because everybody treated him like the baby. His older sister, Shamika, remembered that when their mother had Caleb, Shamika was 17, away at college. Their mother called to announce that Caleb arrived. From the beginning, Caleb was adored. He was supposed to graduate the following year. So when the family lost Gloria, Caleb, and Gigi, the grief did not come in one wave. It came in three: a wife, a mother, grandmother, a son, a brother, granddaughter, a child. Lindsay, Caleb's older sister, said that losing Gigi and Caleb was the hardest part because they were young. Their lives were shortened because of someone else's selfish acts. The family was left empty. And that emptiness is not something a sentence can fully hold. Because when a family loses one person, everything changes. But when a family loses three people in the same act of violence, the whole shape of the family is altered. The chairs that should be filled are empty. The holidays are different. The phone calls stop coming. The future the family imagined has to be rebuilt around absence. And the violence did not end only with the three lives taken inside of that home. Gloria's brother, Robert Everett, reportedly suffered a fatal heart attack after learning what happened. According to reporting at the time, the coroner said Everett had a history of cardiac issues, but the news of this tragedy was part of the devastating context around his death. And I mention that because sometimes the casualties of violence extend beyond the crime scene. The ripple of homicide can reach into the bodies and lives of the people left behind. Investigators had to process the home for forensic evidence, and what they found was brutal. Gloria was lying at the end of the hallway in a pool of her own blood, and Gianna was in the living room. Her injuries were described as brutal. All three victims had been wrapped in blue painter's tape and duct tape. Inside the home, investigators found a 20-pound dumbbell near Gianna's body. They believed it had been used not only to beat Gianna, but all victims. Caleb was found in the walk-in closet. There were small pieces of grass on his socks, which led investigators to believe he had been outside for some period of time. The grass on Caleb's socks suggested movement. It suggested that whatever happened to him may not have started exactly where he was found. So investigators went outside and inspected the backyard. There, they found duct tape and small pieces of tape around the home. And when you're looking at a scene like this, every item has meaning. Tape is not just tape. A locked door or an unlocked door is not just that. And an open window is not just an open window. You get my drift. A missing car is now significant to the investigation. Investigators have to ask what belongs, what does not belong, what was used, what was moved, and what might have been staged to make one story look more believable than another. Robert Short told police on scene that there were clothes missing, jewelry, and vehicles were gone. Missing property can point toward robbery. Missing vehicles can mean escape. But missing property can also complicate a scene. It makes investigators wonder whether theft was the purpose of the crime or whether it was part of what happened after the violence. In those early hours, detectives did not have the full answers yet. They had a family dead inside their home. They had evidence of binding. They had blunt force violence, and they had missing property, missing vehicles. And what was left was a family trying to understand how something this devastating could happen inside a place that should have been safe. Because that is what a home is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a place where you take your shoes off, you let your hair down, let your guard completely down, where you stop performing for the outside world. It is supposed to be the place where the door locks for protection. But on January 4th, 2016, the Short family home became a crime scene. And when a home becomes a crime scene, the violation is bigger than the walls. It reaches into the memory. It changes how people remember rooms, hallways, doors, and windows. Police brought Robert Short to the station for questioning. Detectives remained sensitive to what he had just experienced, witnessing the aftermath of a crime. He identified his wife, son, and his granddaughter's bodies. But detectives still had to ask questions. That is one of the difficult parts of an investigation. Compassion matters, but so does clarity. Detectives have to ask painful, direct questions because the answers may point them toward the truth. They asked about Gianna because she was found with that 20-pound dumbbell near her body. Robert said that, yes, he saw it and he had seen it before because it belonged to a dumbbell set he owned. Now, he believed that it was a 10-pound dumbbell, but it was in fact 20 pounds. Investigators asked whether Caleb or Gloria had problems with anyone. Robert said there was no one he could think of. He told detectives that when he drove up to the home, he saw the garage door open. He thought Gloria maybe went to her hair appointment, but then he discovered not only was her car gone, but the other car they owned was missing as well. That was a 2004 GMC vehicle that was green. Gloria drove a 2014 Volkswagen Beetle. With more than one vehicle missing, investigators believe there may have been multiple suspects. And at that point, whoever had done this was still at large. That is another layer of fear in a case like this. It's not just that a family has been killed, it's the possibility that the person who is responsible is still moving through the same community, posing a threat to the community. And the perpetrators may still be in possession of the family's property and actively trying to get rid of evidence. So detectives had to move carefully, but they also had to move quickly. Autopsies were performed, and investigators committed themselves to bringing the people involved to justice. The question became, who had access to the family? Investigators were able to rule out Gloria and Gianna. Gloria more so than Gianna, because who did a 10-year-old know that would pose an imminent threat? Gloria, they were able to sift through the people that she talked to often, and they realized that she didn't know of anyone who was posing a threat. Their question really began to focus on Caleb, not because he was involved in any trouble, but maybe he unknowingly brought danger to their door. Maybe he connected with someone he was unaware of who was dangerous. So one of the first things they did was they subpoenaed Caleb's phone records. As the detectives reviewed those records, they came across a name, Javarcier Tapley, who was 17 years old. Javarcier had a close relationship with Caleb, so detectives wanted to speak with him. He appeared as someone who knew Caleb, someone who could possibly help investigators understand Caleb's friendships, his conflicts, his routines, give them more insight to the people that were around prior to the murders, or who could be responsible. Gervasier told detectives that Caleb was his friend. He said Caleb could have a smart mouth at times, but overall, he was a sweet kid and he didn't have any issues with anyone. But more importantly, he said they were like brothers. He also said he had not seen Caleb since the previous summer. Javarcier provided his cell phone to be analyzed. He was cooperative and helpful. He answered questions. He handed over his cell phone. He gave detectives a description of Caleb as a person. But investigators also noticed something else. While Javarcier was cooperative, he did not provide a lot of information about who Caleb was outside of the basics. Because if someone tells you they were like brothers with the victim, what would you expect them to know? Odds are you would expect them to know a lot. You would expect more detail, more emotion, more context. Or is everyone different under pressure? We've experienced that in crime cases, especially when police are asking questions in the middle of a murder investigation and you just lost one of your good friends/brothers. At this point, detectives did not have any further questions for him, and they felt that he was being forthcoming, so they kept moving in the investigation, and their focus became the two missing vehicles. Investigators eventually located the vehicles through one of their tracking devices. They had been abandoned in Oakland Park area. Police processed the cars, photographed them, and then had them towed for further analysis. The vehicles were important for more than one reason. If suspects had used the car, the vehicles could hold evidence, fingerprints, DNA, blood, items left behind, or traces that connected the people inside the cars back to the crime scene. Investigators used a blue star reagent test, similar to luminol, to help detect possible traces of blood not visible to the naked eye. In many forensic settings, Blue Star is often preferred over traditional luminol because it can produce a brighter reaction and can be easier for investigators to document at a crime scene. When it's sprayed and photographed in the dark, the reagent can show areas where blood may be present. In this case, the Blue Star reaction showed up on the armrest, the steering wheel, and the gear shift. And it was found that that blood belonged to the victims. Those areas make sense in terms of contact. They are places a person touches while driving, leaning, moving, shifting, and handling the vehicle. For investigators, that meant the car was not just missing property, it could be a part of the evidence trail. While detectives worked the case, the family had to bury three people. According to Lindsay, Caleb's sister and Gloria's daughter, the day of the funeral was surreal. She said her mind protected her from details and from the grief of it. The family held a joint funeral for Gloria, Caleb, and Gianna. Caleb was going to graduate the following year. Gloria had just retired, and Gigi was still in elementary school. More than 1,200 people came to the services. That number says something about the family. It says their lives were connected to many other lives. It says this was not just a private grief, it was community grief. People showed up because Gloria, Caleb, and Gianna mattered. But even surrounded by more than 1,200 people, the family still had the same question. Why? Why them? Why this house? Why this level of violence? And when the early theory is robbery, that question can feel even more senseless because how do clothing, jewelry, and cars become worth 3 lives? But the investigation was about to change. Several days after the funeral, a woman contacted 911. She told them she believed her son was involved in the theft of the cars belonging to the Shorts. When investigators followed up, she said her 19-year-old son, Raheem Gibson, called her and said he was over at someone's house named Weta with 2 other boys. She said when Raheem stopped by her house that evening, he and other friends were driving those vehicles. So detectives bring her down to the police station to interview her. She also mentions that her daughter is the person who saw the coverage of the abandoned vehicles in Oakland Park. And his sister also saw Raheem and other young men driving in those abandoned vehicles. His mother also gave more context. She said that Raheem was hanging around someone by the name of Marcus, and they recently started hanging around a young man named Weta. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his government name. She only knew him as Weta, and they were known in the community as the Three Stooges because they would often get in trouble and do silly things. And she tried to describe it in a way that reminded me of the rhetoric, boys will be boys. She tried to minimize the trouble they were getting into, despite her spidey senses tingling because they were in these abandoned vehicles that were stolen from a house that involved a triple homicide. I just thought that was interesting. Detectives had names. They had Raheem Gibson, and they also had this person named Weta. They knew they needed to speak with Marcus. They bring in Marcus. He is told right from the beginning that he needs to be honest and tell them the truth. He claims he did hang around Raheem, and they recently started hanging around a boy named Weta. And he claimed that on the day in question, Weta and Raheem called him up and asked him if he would go hit a lick. And at the time, he was with his girlfriend and his girlfriend's mother, and they were away from the house. So he said, well, I can't. And they tried to convince him to come because it would be a lot of money. But once again, he reasserts himself and said, I can't go. He claimed that they were riding bikes, that they weren't trying to hit this lick by driving a car. And because he couldn't go, he believed that Weta and Raheem recruited someone else to go hit this lick with them. Now, we already covered last week that hitting a lick means robbery. So trying to bring in those of you who may not know that type of slang. But he told detectives that's all he knew. Detectives were able to verify that Marcus was where he said he was, but they believe that although that information was limited, it still brought them more context because it brought in a possible third individual into the picture. Now, they believe that the reason why Marcus would not say who Weta was when they spoke to him is that they thought Marcus was scared of Weta and he didn't want to bring any heat on himself. Detectives are now focusing all their efforts on talking to Raheem and finding out who Weta was. And this nickname kept resurfacing, and the investigation hinged upon discovering the third assailant and the real name of Weta. While detectives are trying to locate Raheem, Weta, and this possible third assailant, they end up talking to a man who called 911 on the evening of the triple homicide. This man comes in and talks to investigators, and he reported seeing someone who was lurking in the neighborhood of the Shorts because he needed to go to the ATM that night. He is on the phone with his wife, talking about his day, and as he's approaching a stop sign, he sees a man dressed in all black. He had a hood on, and he just seemed to not belong there because the road that he was traveling, most people wouldn't be out lurking at that time of night. And he thought it was odd. As he pulls up to the stop sign, he makes eye contact with the young man who's crossing the street, making his way into the neighborhood. And once they make eye contact, the young man then starts to walk towards the witness's car, and it intimidates him. So he gets off the phone with his wife and quickly calls 911 to report someone lurking in the area. He can't immediately move because there's a car in front of him, but right when the lurker gets in front of his car, he pulls off. He said it made him feel uncomfortable. He describes the young man to police officers, saying he was a light-skinned black man wearing a hoodie and all black, and he was between the age of 20 and 30 years old. Based on that description and based on known associates of Raheem Gibson, investigators developed a photographic lineup, and the witness identified Rufus Burks, who at the time was 15 years old, as the person he saw in the area on the night of the incident. That identification was important because it helped detectives feel more assured about the third perpetrator. They believed they were on track to making arrest. Now the case had more shape. There was the original scene, 3 victims, tape, blood, missing vehicles, property, an open window, and a locked front door. There were the abandoned vehicles in Oakland Park. There was Raheem's mother calling the police. Marcus saying that Raheem and Weta had come up with the idea to hit a lick, and then the witness identifying who they believed the third perpetrator to be, Rufus Burks. But detectives still needed to speak to Raheem and needed to know who Weta was. Eventually, Raheem's mother told investigators where they could find her son. Raheem was transported to headquarters for questioning. Raheem admitted being at the Shorts family home. That was a major moment in the investigation. He told detectives that someone named Quez was at the home with him. He said Quez was the person who made the decision to go to the Short family home because Quez had been there before. According to Raheem, it was just him and Quez who went to the door while Rufus played lookout. He said Quez knocked on the door and said, "It's me, Weta." This is where the case takes a turn, because Weta was not just some unknown person on the edge of the story. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. You can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back, and this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Weta was Javarse Tapley, the same Javarse detectives had already spoken to, who had been in contact with detectives, the same Javarse who said Caleb was his friend, said they were like brothers, who had been treated like a son by the Short family. That is the part that changes the emotional temperature of the case. But according to the investigation, he was not just adjacent, he was central. The Short family had opened their door to him. They had gone on vacation with him. They treated him as a son. And family members have said this was not casual familiarity. This was someone they had known since he was a baby. Someone folded into the family long before this crime. And if that betrayal did not already feel unbearable, there is another detail that makes it even harder to sit with. According to family reporting, Javarcier came to pay respects in the immediate aftermath and was embraced by grieving loved ones while carrying knowledge of the violence itself. And there is something psychologically staggering about that. That grief and betrayal could occupy the same room. And when Raheem described that moment at the door, it became even heavier. It's me, Weta. Think about what that means. If someone says that at your door, it means they expect the name to matter. They expect recognition. The person inside the home is supposed to understand that this is not a stranger. And how do you protect yourself from a threat that announces itself like family? That is what makes this case so painful. The danger did not have to force its way in as a stranger. It had familiarity, access, and had the kind of connection that makes people lower their guard. Investigators looked at social media accounts and saw communication between Javarcier and Rufus that indicated they both were involved. They also found that clothes and items had been put up for sale online that belonged to the Shorts. Police arrested Rufus Burks. They detained him and brought him in, as well as Tapley. Investigators obtained search warrants for photographs, fingerprints, and DNA. Detectives tried to give Javarcier an opportunity to talk after they collected his DNA and took photographs, but he didn't. Investigators later obtained a letter from a cellmate of Javarcier. According to that letter, Javarcier confessed to the inmate while also threatening him that he killed 3 people before and that he would kill his inmate because he was never going to get out anyway. According to that letter, Tapley said he did not regret doing what he did, and if given the opportunity, he would do it again. He also said he was going to kill the lookout, but he didn't have enough time. Investigators believe the motive was jealousy. Their working theory was Tapley contacted Caleb and asked him to come outside to speak with him. Caleb was then ambushed and assaulted and then dragged into the backyard. From there, investigators believe the perpetrators went through the window and entered the residence. They bound all 3 victims. They assaulted them by striking them multiple times with a 20-pound dumbbell. Investigators testified that the victims suffered extreme head trauma. Reporting indicates the official cause of death was blunt force trauma for all 3 victims and that Gloria and Gianna also sustained stab wounds. There is no way to soften that. There is no way to make the details less heavy. Gloria, Caleb, and Gianna were not simply killed. They were overpowered, bound, beaten, inside a home where at least one of the people involved had once been welcome. That is the fact that the family had to live with. Not only that they were gone, but that someone they cared for was tied to that violence. When Javarcier Tapley was confronted with the evidence, he pled guilty to 3 counts of malice murder. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Raheem Gibson entered a guilty plea to malice murder and was sentenced to 30 years. Rufus Burks, who was just 15 years old at the time of the murders, took his chances at trial. He was convicted and received 2 consecutive life sentences plus additional years on related charges. Authorities largely framed the killings as robbery, alleging money, clothing, vehicles, and other property were taken from the home. And yet I think part of what has lingered around this case is whether greed alone ever fully explains the brutality at this level. Those sentences brought legal accountability, but accountability and healing are not the same thing. Shamika Alvaretti, who is the mother of Gigi and the daughter and sister to Caleb and Gloria, says this about the betrayal. When she found out it was Javarcier, she said that he had been around the family, that Gloria bought clothes for him. He had even been around Gigi multiple times during family vacations. She claimed that anything he could have wanted, they would have supplied because of the love they had for him. And that is why this case does not end neatly with sentencing. Because the court can say what the punishment is, the court can put years and life sentences on paper, but the family still has to carry the knowledge of what was done and who was involved. They have to carry the contradiction. This was someone they knew. someone they helped, they trusted near their children, someone who had been treated with love, and still, Gloria, Caleb, and Gigi were taken. Takeaway. I think we could easily stay with the stranger versus the one you trust conversation in this case, and it would fit because it is here. But if you're an avid true crime listener, you already know one of the hard truths we return to again and again that so much violence comes not from strangers, but from people close to the victim. We know that. And because the truth is already so clear in this case, I want to pivot away from the obvious. Because what lingers for me in this case is not simply betrayal, it's the corruption of care. Because the pain here is not only that someone trusted caused harm, it is that love, generosity, and familial inclusion were exploited. The Short family did not simply know Javarcier, they made room for him, supported him, treated him like one of their own. And there is something especially devastating when the very gestures meant to sustain someone become part of what is violated. That is different than violence committed by a stranger. That reaches into something deeper. And I think that is why this case unsettles people in such a lasting way. It forces us to sit with a harder question. What do you do with betrayal that grows in the soil of care? And there's another layer I keep thinking about. Sometimes we talk about betrayal as though it grows only out of hatred, but sometimes it can grow out of something more complicated: envy, entitlement, resentment. A belief that kindness is owed rather than received as grace. And maybe that's part of what makes this case so disturbing. Because generosity was met not with gratitude, but with destruction. And that's hard to absorb. And there's another unsettling layer here we haven't even touched. These perpetrators were young, 15, 17, 19. That is significant. When people that young participate in violence this calculated, it forces us to ask harder questions, not just about individual choices, but about what is happening around them. What failures of guidance, intervention, moral imagination allow young people to move this close to brutality? And I'm not saying youth explains evil, it doesn't, nor does it excuse what they did. Never that. But I do think cases like this push us to confront something uncomfortable about a society where some young people are carrying adult level violence before they even fully entered adulthood. That should trouble us all, not only because of what happened here, but because of what it says about what can harden people this early. That is bigger than this case and worth sitting with. Many of us are taught that love protects, that if you pour into people, if you help them, you treat them like family, that means something. And it should. But this case reminds us that another person's capacity to betray does not make the love extended to them a mistake. I want to say that plainly. That failure here was not in the Short's kindness. The failure was in the person who exploited it. I think the deeper truth is that betrayal says more about the betrayer than the people who loved. That may be the part this family carries forever. Not only grief, but the unanswered contradiction of love and violence occupying the same story. And even 10 years later, family members have spoken about faith and therapy as a part of learning how to carry what cannot be undone. Healing in cases like this is not forgetting. It's learning how to live beside grief. And we remember Gloria, Caleb, and little Gigi. I hope we remember not only how profoundly they were wronged, but how profoundly they were loved. A mother described as everybody's mom, a teenage son on the cusp of graduation, a little girl her mother called a spark in a dark world. Because that love existed before this crime, it deserves to be remembered louder than the betrayal. In a more recent development, Varcier was reportedly charged in 2025 in connection with an alleged assault on a correctional officer while incarcerated. Doesn't look like much has changed, in the world of divorcee. If this episode moved you, challenged you, or gave you something to think about, make sure you're subscribed to Murder in the Black wherever you listen. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss new episodes when they drop. And if this case stirred thoughts for you, I'd love to hear them respectfully in the comments or over on Instagram. Or simply, you can go on over to Substack where we go deeper into the episode when we just don't have time here. Don't forget, Storytime with Steph drops Wednesdays and our full-length episodes drop every Thursday, so make sure you're tapped in for both. And if you know of a case that needs more attention, send it my way via DM or email. You know I'm always listening. And whether or not the case has a completion or not, we can always feature it in our True Crime and Current News segment. But before I let you go, if you've been following the David case, I did drop a special edition of Storytime with Steph video on Tuesday. I was breaking down everything we knew up until that point. Since then, more details have emerged, including newly released autopsy findings showing Celeste Rivas Hernandez died from multiple penetrating injuries, and her death has been ruled a homicide. The homicide part is obvious, but we've been waiting for those autopsy results for quite some time. So that's the newest evidence that has emerged in the case. Now, there is still more unfolding, and I'll be featuring updates if they come in on next week's episode in our True Crime and Current News segment. So make sure you stay tuned. Make sure you're keeping up with Storytime with Steph, because every now and then I'll drop an extra video there as well. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. Stay safe, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.